Here's the arrow firing from his chest before he releases the bow, right? You can see it change physical trajectories and then change angles after it changes trajectories. You can see it still lerping to its destination, and then we can see it disappearing. It's not a sexy look. Hey, welcome to a new video. Today, I wanted to do something a little bit different. There is a game that I play that I'm very passionate about called Age of Empires 2, and the sequel to a sequel to that game, Age of Empires 4, was recently given a really deep look into. A lot of people are coming off the back of playing Age of Empires 2 competitively, and they're really excited about this Age of Empires 4, which takes place in the same era, right? Pre and post medieval warfare. And the actual feedback on the game, as far as what we've seen so far, has been really mixed. So I wanted to cover some of that feedback, one of my gripes, and to sort of take a bit of a deeper dive into the technical constraints, the design implications, and just to give some context for players and viewers who like this channel and the stuff I talk about in the channel. So this is Age of Empires 4, a deep look into arrows. The first thing I want to do is just show you a little bit of what we've got here in the game. A lot of beautiful environments. You can see some arrows being fired here already, down from a tower onto mounted cavalry. I think the game looks beautiful. It's got a lot of nice visual effects. We've got particle systems for smoke, lovely shadows. It's a really gorgeous looking game. And so here is where I wanted to spotlight. Now, I just want you to watch the flight path of these arrows and just watch them as you normally would, and we'll talk about it in a second. So straight out the gate, there are a few things that really bother me. One is that the arrows, to me, they seem to stick out, right? And they stick out for a few reasons. As I'm watching, I feel like the flight paths are really unnatural. They feel very steep and very fast. Also, on impact, the arrows seem to kind of hang in the air, and it's really jarring to look at in the middle of the fight to see these, make their way through the level, and it's a bit of a sore thumb in the visual presentation. In what is otherwise a very elegantly nuanced styled game, the arrows seem to not be that cohesive. So as a designer and also a developer, there are a few things that are really important when I'm thinking about how to implement something in my game. So when we think about implementing a bow is a historical object. It's also a real life object. And our perceptions as people, just in the world, when we consume media, when we have our own experiences about how bow and arrows work, there is ultimately an abstraction that we have in our minds about how they work that models reality, right? So we have the physics of the real world, we have our perceptions based on movies that we watch, TV, our own experiences, and there is also the game space, right? There is what makes sense in the world that we're building as a simulation. There is what's fair, what looks good and works well under the constraints we've created, and just the execution, right? The technical implementation with the art style. So we have to consider as designers all of those things together. And when thinking about as a player why this is jarring to me, it's all coming down to that first part. It's my expectations based on my understanding of what's real and what looks good versus what I'm seeing. So when we break this down, there are a few things. When we think about these arrows in the game, there are a bunch of different properties that the arrow has that we are noticing as we're watching to give us our impression of what's going on, right? So the first thing is the size of the arrow, okay? These arrows are pretty large, oversized, I would say, relative to the characters that are firing them. They are a very bright color, probably a little bit brighter than what you'd expect. We notice their spawn position, so where they appear at the beginning, the arc that they take, that's something that we think about, the angle that they're facing during the arc, the impact and destruction as well. Let's talk about the speed, spawn position, arc, angle, and impact. These are kind of the big things for me, which I think detract from the presentation of the arrows in the game. So the first would be like the spawn position. So we have here on this frame, the character is pulling their bow back. On the next frame, the arrow spawns. The arrow actually spawns somewhere near their feet. You can see this is kind of like, it's somewhere from down here, not where the bow is being pulled from. And because this is an RTS, we don't necessarily have the fidelity to be able to pinpoint and orient the arrow inside of the animation. It's something that you could definitely do, games do it all the time, but probably or potentially too expensive a process to care about in an RTS, especially because this takes up exactly 1 frame, right? It's not something that you really notice in isolation and at full speed. One thing you may notice is that the actual arrow has, taken flight before the animation has actually loosed the arrow. So the arrow starts traveling and the archer is still waiting around. This is, again, another implementation thing. In Age of Empires 2, whenever the actual balance of arrows was changed, so certain units, for example, cavalry archers, they might have to stop for a period of time before firing. If that period of time is balanced to be tighter, as in the archers have to wait less time before they fire the arrows, then it makes those archers more effective, but the animation doesn't change. So the actual delay time, the spawn time for the arrow, could be changed with balance patches without having any budget to change the animation to match it. So historically, we can expect that this sort of desynchronization is possible, but I would say pre-release, this is something that you would probably want to get at least closer, because it's not until the arrow is in like full flight, this is like halfway towards its target, that we see the character loose the arrow. If it was later, I feel like that would be less of an issue, but the fact that it's so early, I don't know, could be tighter. So if we watch the actual path of the arrow, right, this is the arrow here. Let's watch it as it passes through. Okay, so it looks like it kind of moves in a straight line and then begins changing direction mid-path to move this way, and then changes again towards the target, towards the end. So just from this screenshot, what we see is something that looks like this as far as the flight path is concerned. Okay, and if you were to plot this horizontally, it would look something like this. Right, it's kind of like trapezoidal. Now, arrows in real life obviously are ballistic objects and they follow a ballistic trajectory. That trajectory looks like a parabola, which is kind of something like this. Okay, and what we're looking at here, what we're seeing from just like an implementation perspective is either, it's one of two things, right? It's either a straight line that has been tweaked to just create some elevation to kind of simulate a parabola, but in a way that doesn't cost quite as much, or it's like a downsampled Bezier, right? So it's like maybe the path was something like this and they just created a sort of downsampled interpretation of it. If we watch the actual arrow angle, so the way that the arrow is facing, in real life, the arrow would always be facing its trajectory, right? If the arrow is heading downwards, it should be facing downwards. If it's heading upwards, it should be facing up. If we watch the arrows here, you can actually see that the arrow's not facing where it's going. It's kind of lifted. And then when it changes trajectory and starts heading downwards, it's still facing its original direction, and it only slowly interpolates down. So what we're actually seeing is the arrow position looks something like this, and this might be, we'll call this A, we'll call this B. The actual arrow angle goes from this to this in a way that is like linearly interpolated. So what it's doing is it's taking this and it's transforming into this in a way that kind of looks like this. Okay, so it's kind of like smoothly animating over each of the frames towards its final trajectory, almost like it knows where it's going to be facing, where it ends up. But this is sort of disconnected to this, right? Because what's actually happening is throughout these frames, it's heading this way. Throughout these frames, it's heading this way, and these frames, it's heading this way. As far as the implementation here, I can't speak to what the developers of Age of Empires 4 are dealing with as far as constraints go. But what I can say is that one principle of design that I always try to stick to when I'm developing is to have as few rules as possible and to make sure that basically cohesion comes before nuance. So there are a few things that are trying to be captured here, right? We're trying to capture this smooth ballistic arc. We know that the angle of the arrow needs to change over time, but we obviously have some kind of constraint that we're playing to here with the actual pathing of the arrow. And on the flip side, we still have some interest in maintaining that smooth angle interpolation over time. The issue is that because these are inconsistent, the actual fact that there are two different rules that are applying to something that should be bound to one is creating more confusion, not less. So rather than this helping, it's actually hurting. Instead, I would probably just go towards literally having the arrow face the direction that it's moving. If we couldn't get a perfect Bezier, then just have the arrow fly straight. It is a really interesting situation, right? Like if you were to just like try to solve this Xeno's arrow with Occam's razor, the question comes, why do the arrows have such steep angles in the first place, right? If we look at that last section there, it's really curious as to like what's going on that would make the developers need to create such an angle, such a dramatic angle when firing the arrows. So I wanted to do a little bit of research on this before I made this video because I didn't want to make a fool out of myself. Disclaimer, there are lots and lots of different kinds of bows that made their way through history. They all had different kinds of arrows that they fired. And so speeds of flight, the impact, the weight, all of these things change over time and with different cultures and techniques. That said, there is some basic mathematics that we can do to kind of like dispel all of that and just think about what flight paths should be like, right? If we were to just think about reality for a second, right? Remember, we're trying to cater to players' interpretations of reality. So we should at least be conscious of reality first and then, you know, change things to be more or less, you know, toward the direction of the aesthetic that we want, depending on what we can do technically and what we want to do. So it looks like, independently of kind of culture and arrow type, a trained bowman could fire an arrow at a rate of anywhere between, 60 to 70 meters per second. Okay, I'm gonna lowball this one and just stick to 55 meters per second. We know that gravity moves at 9.8. It's 9.8 seconds squared. But if we're just talking about the first second of travel, we just use 9.8. So if we factor in this amount of drop over this distance over 1 second, then we're only really talking about 10 degrees, right? This is just basic trigonometry, A10, opposite over adjacent, and that gives us 10 degrees, right? So what this basically means is that if you're firing a bow at a target 50 meters away, over the first second of flight, it's going to fall 10 meters, right? 10 degrees is not a lot of elevation. This is mostly a straight arrow. It might drop a little bit, but as far as like creating this crazy arc that looks like this, that's just not what we're seeing here. We're only seeing a 10% drop. That's not enough to angle up this high when we start firing. It's more like this at best. The question then becomes, why did the AoE devs develop these angles to be so steep, right? Why do the arrows seem to rise up and fall? I was doing a little bit of scrubbing around through the trailer just to see some other examples of arrows being fired in the game. And I noticed that actually towers don't fire at the same trajectories as arrows being fired from the ground. So if we watch these arrows being fired from the tower, okay, they're spawning in a pretty interesting position above the tower, and they're orienting to their intended direction. But once they do that, they pretty much fire in a straight line, right? We can't see any angles here. There's no ballistics going on. And it doesn't seem to be something that is necessarily scaled. It seems binary. It seems like if we're this high, we just fire straight. If we're down here, we fire in these really high, tight angles. And I was thinking about why this might be the case. And I'm going to put together a theory. And my theory is that this has to do with the collision-based way in which arrows need to be implemented for this game, or at least have been decided to be implemented. So if we were just talking about a game where we had like a gun, right? I'm not going to draw this very well, but you can see what I'm trying to do here, right? If we have a gun, we could basically just treat the gun's bullet as a vector, right? As a thing that travels instantaneously. We can draw, a trace from the path of the bullet that can be instantaneous. We can have a nice dissipating, trail on the end of that. And for all intents and purposes, we can kind of ignore everything that's in between, right? If somebody here is firing at somebody here, we don't really need to think about what's happening from when the bullet is fired to when it hits its target. The difference here is that in Age of Empires, and this has kind of always been the case since Age of Empires 2, is that arrows actually do have a kind of collision. Arrows can miss their intended target, they can hit other targets, they do have a travel time. So one of the potential design challenges that we could be running into is maybe we aren't just determining the damage from when we fire the arrow to where it's going to hit its target. This isn't something that's predetermined in Age of Empires. This is something that we have to think about in a physics context. And that provides a really, really interesting and difficult challenge because it intersects a bunch of different things that we were talking about at the beginning. It's real world physics intersecting with game physics, which intersects with game mechanics. So, if we're playing an RTS, we don't really expect to see the arrows colliding with things like buildings, like trees. When we tell a unit to fire at another unit, we kind of expect for the accuracy to be predetermined, or if there is any kind of, lower than 100% accuracy, we expect that to kind of be interpreted as almost like a dice roll at the point where we tell the unit to fire its bow. We expect to be able to see the arrow going from A to B, but from a development side, if these arrows need to be collision objects, then it makes it much, much more difficult to just dress up the visual presentation. I mean, let's think about the space, right? What happens if we fire a bow from A to B and there is a lovely cliffside elevation in the way? Can a unit down here fire at a unit up here? Is that something that we expect to be able to happen? What do we expect to see visually? Do we expect to see the arrow lob over? Do we expect to see the arrow go straight through? Would that be jarring enough for it to not work? Do we expect for the arrow to have a consistent travel time? Should accuracy be something that goes down with distance? In real life, the answer is yes, of course. The further away you fire, the more you expect the accuracy to deviate. But in an RTS, if you research a technology that gives your archers 100% accuracy, do you not expect the arrows to, at least from a ballistics perspective, be 100% accurate? These are things where, again, the real world physics and the design are kind of fighting with each other. And as a designer, you have to make a decision between, okay, what makes sense for the game and then what makes sense visually. In my opinion, when I think about this stuff, I mean, it's clearly something where the transition from 2D to 3D is a real challenge. So in Age of Empires 2, arrow pathing is kind of a non-issue. The entire design space of the game, the actual play space, is a 2D isometric grid. And I've been doing a lot of videos on isometric recently, so this is something that I'm a little more qualified to talk about. But as far as the actual game space is defined, there is no real Z-axis. That is to say, there are no flying enemies or characters. There are no units that can be technically above other units. There is elevation, but the elevation is happening on a 2D plane. You can think of the level as like a blanket that is being deformed up and down, rather than a context where you have, you can't have somebody standing on a bridge over somebody else. That's just not something that you can really do in the game. So arrow pathing doesn't need to be thinking about the Z collision, right? Or the Y collision, depending on which way you want to think about the axis, right? There's no context where if I have a wall that this would miss this, that looks like a Latus. This guy's not going to miss him because the arrow collided with the wall. We don't expect that as players. We just expect that the arrow is going to fly visually on screen and land where the unit was told to fire. I think from a player's perspective, that makes perfect sense, right? It satisfies the visual constraint. It doesn't end in weird environmental reasons why something should have happened but didn't. So it never feels unfair. But this is really, really easy to do in a 2D isometric context, because with isometric, you can pretty much see everything at all times. Because, nothing ever, from our perspective, feels obscured, we expect that the same thing can be said for the units. It's kind of one of those funny psychological tricks where even if there's a wall between me and something in the next room, if you can see me and that thing from your perspective and I look to the right, you think that I can see it, even though I clearly can't, but you can. So because we can see from A to B, we expect the line of sight to be the same for both. In 3D, this is a totally different situation, right? We've seen footage of archers standing on top of walls that have doorways that other enemies and units are standing underneath. We have arrows coming down at units. Because we can move the camera wherever we want, that perspective lock is broken. So there's no way to force that perspective and assume that an arrow should just be able to land where we want it to land. One final thought, and to come back to the original question of why the angles in Age of Empires 4 seem to have this strange either trapezoidal or down-sampled Bezier curve to them, is imagine if we were to think of this as a straight line. If the target was this character here, this unit, and for whatever reason we passed beyond that unit because the unit moved, do we expect for the arrow to hit the unit behind? Do we expect for the arrow to keep traveling until it terminates in the ground somewhere off in the distance? Imagine how you would feel if you have a unit that's standing all the way over here, an arrow passes by a unit that was an intended target, the arrow travels all the way forward and then hits this guy over here. Would that feel fair? It's a strange thing to think about, right? So my theory is that the reason why we have these really, really tight, high curves is actually to create a scenario where from the firing point to the destination, we actually cancel out any potential of colliding with anything before the target or after the target by firing the arrow into the air, passing through the air until we come to the target, and then descending down, dive bombing down onto the target. This way, the arrow always lands where the intended position was, can never pass through anything on the way, and can never overextend. If this is the case, I can empathize with why it is the way that it is, but I think from a player's perspective, there definitely needs to be work done to iron out how this is shown visually. I think definitely this angle should be as low as possible. The higher it is, the weirder it looks. The final thing that I wanted to say about the arrows that bugs me, that I think could be much, much better, is the way the arrows dissipate. So when the arrows hit their target, what's happening right now is they hit the target, they stay exactly where they are in world space when they terminate, and then they just disappear, they just despawn. If possible, I would be searching for some way to either have an arrow, successfully hit target animation. So a splintering maybe there are, fractures of timber, flying off when the arrow lands at its destination. Right now, having them just disappear feels weird. Of course, this is an RTS, and I know that we're looking at these environments in a very zoomed in context. I know that when we're playing the game, you would expect to be looking at this from much further away. I'm just going to stop you there, Adam. Just before I wrap up, I wanted to give a summary argument about what my feedback is, and if I was giving this feedback to somebody on the team, what would that actually involve doing? Obviously, this is all hypothetical. I don't know anybody who works on the team. This is just me talking. But I would say what's really important is that, the feedback is clear and that we prioritize the most important things, right? We don't get tunnel vision down into areas that don't matter. So what matters here in this context is we need to know, as the player who is commanding the archers, that the arrows are firing and when they're firing. So having the animation sync up is relatively important, as well as having the actual animation, the spawn point of the arrows be, not too far away from exactly where they're being fired from. That is important. Throughout the flight path, it's actually not important that the arrows are, the most visible thing on screen. I mean, in this screenshot here, we can see the blade tips on these lances. Those are important because we need to know what unit we're actually looking at. There are multiple different cavalry units and they have different types and, you know, different weapons. But the arrows flying through the air are not important. What's important is that we know what the path is, but not that we can make out individual arrows, you know, over cavalry, for example. We need to be able to see the cavalry and the units. And in fact, because the arrows are, you know, moving through the air, they're closer to the camera, they can actually be an eyesore in flight. So we really would want to deprioritize the arrows in flight. We don't need them to be scaled up. We don't need them to be brighter than everything else on screen. Then, as the player on the receiving end, we need to know whether the arrows hit or didn't. We need to know when damage has been done to a unit. So the landing position of the arrow is important. And then just having, you know, beyond that, everything else about the arrow be deprioritized. So the way it despawns, if it pops out, that's actually more visually eye-catching than if it fades out. So it either should, you know, have some sort of animation where at the end of the animation it's gone, or it should just fade out. As far as the trajectory stuff goes, I would say it's probably a priority to keep the trajectories at a predictable angle, and it's less of a priority that the collisions are respected. We've already seen arrows go through trees. I mean, in real life, you couldn't do that. The arrows would bounce off the branches or they'd get caught up. So in that sense, I would say if we can, you know, lower the angle of the arrow's ballistic arc, and that looks natural across the board, like 99% of the time it makes the arrows look better. I would say the 1 or 2% where an arrow clips through a wall or through some very, very steep terrain, I would take that. Even if the arrow destination is the only place where the arrow can collide with anything. So, you know, if it happens to pass through a unit on the way to its destination, I would be okay with that unit not taking damage. I don't think that's really too jarring, as long as the visual presentation of the arrow gave that impression somehow. So if, you know, it sort of looked more like a wispy path when it was in flight and then became more opaque when it was approaching its destination, if that looked better, I would say that was a win, as opposed to having these, you know, very visually eye-catching arcs that seem to grab our attention in the way that they betray physics. So those are my thoughts, and back to you. There's so much that goes into this, and this was the point of this video. I really wanted to walk you through the constraints and the considerations that someone in this position has to be thinking about. And we haven't even talked about performance yet. So there you go. That's my little breakdown on the arrows in Age of Empires 4. Let me know what you thought of this structure and this kind of video. Am I just taking speculative shots from a distance? Maybe I should shut my mouth. But it was certainly fun for me. So I'll catch you in the next one. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice. Thanks again, and until next time.